This is the real mystery of Baalbek, how these stones came to be there, why they were placed there, and specifically how they were transported into place.
They said the mystery was solved, that finally, after centuries of speculation, debate, and dead ends, the answer had arrived. But when researchers looked closer at what had actually been uncovered, the feeling wasn't relief, it was discomfort, because the conclusion didn't just challenge history, it undermined it. It suggested that what we've been taught about the rise of civilization might not be incomplete, but fundamentally wrong. And worse, it hinted that whatever built these structures didn't simply vanish. It failed, and failure on that scale tends to leave warnings behind. The problem is, we don't always recognize them until we're repeating the same pattern. If you stand in the Bekaa Valley long enough, you start to feel it before you understand it. The land is calm, almost deceptively so. Farmers tend their crops, vendors line the roadside, and the pace of life feels grounded, predictable. Nothing about the surroundings prepares you for what rises in the distance. Because when Baalbek comes into view, it doesn't emerge gradually. It interrupts the landscape. It dominates it. Towering columns, massive stonework, geometry that feels deliberate beyond aesthetics. It's not just large, it's excessive, as if whoever built it wasn't constrained by the same limits we assume governed the ancient world. Most people who visit are drawn to the Roman structures first, and understandably so. The Temple of Jupiter stands as one of the most impressive remnants of the Roman Empire. Even in ruin, it commands attention. The scale alone is enough to overwhelm. But what many don't realize is that what they're looking at isn't the beginning of the story. It's the continuation of something much older. The Romans didn't start here. They built on top of something they may not have fully understood themselves. Beneath those towering columns lies a foundation that changes everything. 3 enormous stone blocks sit side by side, each weighing roughly 800 tons. Numbers like that are difficult to grasp, so people often compare them to modern objects. A fully loaded Boeing 747 weighs less, and that's just one of these stones. These aren't rough, naturally shaped rocks either. They've been cut with extraordinary precision, placed so tightly together that even now, after thousands of years, the seams between them are nearly invisible. No mortar, no binding material, just stone meeting stone with a level of accuracy that challenges modern engineering. This is where the narrative starts to break down. Because while the Romans were exceptional builders, nothing in their documented capabilities comes close to this. Their largest known stone movements are a fraction of this weight. Their techniques, tools, and infrastructure simply don't account for something of this scale. And yet there it is, forming the very base of one of their grandest temples. Not far from the site, in a nearby quarry, the mystery deepens even further. Massive stones lie partially carved, still attached to the bedrock as if the work was abandoned mid-process. One of them, often called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs around 1,000 tons. Nearby, an even larger block was discovered more recently, estimated at 1,650 tons. These aren't just bigger, they're beyond practical necessity. There's no clear reason why any ancient builder would need stones this large, especially when smaller ones would have sufficed structurally. And that raises a question that's far more unsettling than how did they move them. The real question is, why were they trying to? Because whatever process was being used here, it wasn't reaching its limit at 800 tons. It was pushing beyond that, experimenting, scaling up, and then suddenly it stopped. No signs of destruction, no evidence of catastrophic interruption at the quarry itself. Just unfinished work. Tools put down, effort abandoned. For a long time, explanations tried to stay within comfortable boundaries. The Romans did it, or if not the Romans, then some earlier, less understood culture using brute force and ingenuity. But as more researchers began to examine the site closely, those explanations started to fall apart. The marks on the stones didn't match known Roman techniques. The precision didn't align with hand tools. Even the weathering patterns suggested a timeline that didn't quite fit with conventional dating. Then came the engineering problem. When modern engineers attempted to model the movement of these stones using known ancient methods, rollers, ropes, ramps, the results were consistent. It didn't work. Not just impractical. Not inefficient. Impossible under realistic conditions. The forces required exceeded what ancient materials could handle. The manpower needed surpassed what the region could have supported. Every simulation ended the same way: structural failure, material breakdown, or logistical collapse. For centuries, that's where the discussion stalled. Because without new data, the argument simply looped, until recently. When advanced scanning technologies were introduced to the site, the goal wasn't to prove a theory. It was to collect information, detailed, precise, unbiased. Laser scanning mapped every surface down to sub-millimeter accuracy. Ground-penetrating radar revealed hidden structural details. High-resolution imaging captured tool marks invisible to the naked eye. And then that data was analyzed using machine learning systems trained to recognize patterns across thousands of historical construction sites. What emerged wasn't a clean answer. It was something far more complicated. The analysis identified multiple types of tool marks on the stones. Some matched known ancient tools. Others didn't match anything currently documented. Certain surfaces showed signs of cutting or finishing that appeared too consistent, too uniform to be explained by manual labor alone. In some cases, the stone itself exhibited microscopic changes consistent with exposure to significant heat during processing, something not typically associated with ancient stoneworking methods. Even more striking was the precision of the stone placement. Measurements showed deviations of less than half a millimeter across surfaces spanning several meters. That level of accuracy is difficult to achieve even with modern equipment. And yet, it exists here, embedded in structures that predate what we consider advanced technology. Simulations were then run to test possible construction scenarios. Thousands of variations were explored, incorporating different techniques, materials, and workforce sizes. None succeeded. Not one produced a viable method for moving and placing stones of this scale under the constraints of ancient technology. At that point, the question shifted again. It was no longer just about Baalbek. It became about patterns, because when similar analysis techniques were applied to other megalithic sites around the world, unexpected connections began to appear. Not identical methods, but shared principles. Recurring geometric alignments, consistent use of oversized stone blocks beyond structural necessity, locations that aligned with specific latitudinal bands associated with astronomical significance. Individually, these might be coincidences. Collectively, they form something harder to dismiss. And then came the most controversial aspect, the dating. Using environmental and material analysis, some of these structures appeared to be significantly older than traditionally accepted timelines. Not by a few hundred years, but by thousands. Periods that would place their construction before the emergence of known complex civilizations. Before writing, before organized agriculture in some regions. That doesn't just challenge history, it disrupts the entire framework we use to understand human development. But the most unsettling pattern wasn't technological, it was temporal. Across multiple sites, periods of large-scale construction seemed to precede major disruptions, climate shifts, societal collapses, environmental changes. Not during prosperity, but at the edge of decline. As if these structures weren't just achievements, but responses, final efforts, or perhaps warnings, as it's difficult to prove intent across thousands of years. But the correlation is there, which brings us back to Baalbek. If the builders possessed knowledge or techniques beyond what we currently understand, that knowledge didn't survive. There's no clear lineage connecting it to later civilizations, no gradual evolution, just absence, as if something was lost abruptly. That raises two possibilities. Either the knowledge was destroyed by external events, climate, disaster, collapse, or it was abandoned. And that second possibility is the more uncomfortable one, because it suggests choice, a recognition of limits, a decision to stop. Today, Baalbek still stands, not fully intact, not fully understood, but undeniably present. Around it, life continues in a way that feels almost disconnected from the scale of what's there. People live, some work, raise families, all within sight of stones that defy explanation. And maybe that's the most telling part, because whatever built this didn't just leave behind structures, it left behind questions, not just about the past, but about cycles, about progress, about what happens when capability outpaces sustainability. We tend to look at ancient ruins as beginnings, the first steps towards civilization. But what if some of them are endings instead? The final expressions of cultures that reached a peak and then disappeared. If that's true, then Baalbek isn't just a mystery, it's a message. Not about how something was built, but about what happens after.